Released in 1978, the original Halloween is a horror movie classic, and one which a lot of horror fans would list amongst their favourite films of the genre. Genuinely terrifying, with an antagonist who struck fear in the hearts of audiences across the world, the film has sadly been dragged down by a series of lackluster sequels, which diluted not only the original film, but Michael Myers as a villain. Halloween 2018 changes this, finally giving us a sequel worthy of the original, bringing Michael Myers back to the original roots of his evil, and also brilliantly reconstructing the character of Laurie Strode into a complex trauma survivor.
Do you know that I pray every night that he would escape?
What the hell did you do that for?
So I can kill him.
It also manages to modernise the film and make it feel relevant without resting on the usual and tired slasher tropes of the genre. Warning, spoilers ahead. At the centre, and really the heart of the film, is Jamie Lee Curtis's Laurie Strode, now a mother and grandmother, and utterly determined to keep herself and her loved ones safe. Her trauma from that fateful Halloween night so long ago having haunted her throughout most of her life. The characterization of Laurie somewhat echoes her characterization from Halloween H2O, the only film of the sequels which is actually half decent, and one which I personally would not have minded remaining canon. It feels as if the writers of the new film used H2O Laurie as a blueprint for their version of the character. In H2O, Laurie was living under an alias, paranoid and scared of Michael finding her, plagued with nightmares, and overzealously protective of her son. Halloween's 2018 Laurie is a toughened yet paranoid survivor who could comfortably draw parallels to a character such as Sarah Connor, traumatized and scared to the point that she lost custody of her child, and in the present being quite alienated from her family. Laurie Strode has spent decades of her life preparing for the night she would meet Michael again, yet she is not above or beyond succumbing to her fear and trauma, brilliantly illustrated in a scene where Michael and a group of patients are transported out of the mental asylum. Laurie sits in her car with a gun, finger caressing the trigger, facing her fear, and yet the sight of the bus triggers her PTSD, and she hallucinates seeing the shape, later breaking down at a family dinner in a scene which reverts her to the scared 17-year-old of the original film, tearfully declaring,
What's the boogeyman?
Laurie's trauma humanizes her character and, as with many recent horror films, shows the reality of surviving such an event at such a young age. Her vulnerability and fear allows the audience to connect with and sympathize with her, and her raw, undecorated, and extremely realistic PTSD makes her characterization feel organic and earned. Interestingly, the movie presents Laurie and Michael almost as foils. They are two people who had lasting effects on one another and who have both essentially been living as caged animals for the past 40 years, put there by each other. Michael's new Loomis stand-in muses that Michael may fear Laurie as much as she fears him. She is, after all, the only person to ever have wounded and escaped him. And this theory is seemingly confirmed when Laurie encounters Michael outside a murder scene and shoots at him, and he flees. Laurie as a foil for the villain allows for more creativity with her character. She has seemingly inherited Michael's near invincibility, falling from a balcony and, in a pretty sweet mirror of one of the final scenes of the original film, disappearing, having survived the fall. In another beautifully mirrored scene, she appears out of the shadows behind Michael, indicating the switch in their positions, she now the hunter and he the prey. Michael himself is still a creature of terror, and by ignoring the subpar sequels which greatly diluted him as a villain, both by his retcon familial relationship with Laurie and by the Curse of the Thorn, this film restores him to what he originally was, so eloquently phrased by Dr. Loomis in the original film.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
However, Michael does not remain a stagnant character. 40 years have passed since the events of the original film, and it is shown how with this passing of time, coupled with his incarceration, Michael has become more violent, more bloodthirsty, and more sadistic. In 40 years, he hasn't spoken a single word, unwilling to bend to anyone's will and refusing to allow anyone to dissect, analyze, or pigeonhole him. As in the original film, he has no motive other than being pure evil, no obvious driving force, no familial ties. He kills because he can, a monster with no conscience. Yet he is changed, but the differences between this Michael and the Michael we encountered in the original film in no way lessen the effectiveness of his terror. In the original film, much of Michael's terror came from his elusiveness and his voyeurism. He was always there, watching and waiting, the boogeyman children fear lurking in the shadows. He was so terrifying because he was a monster from childhood nightmares, a not quite real figment of horror. 40 years later, Michael is terrifying for the opposite reason. The terror comes from the fact that he is so incredibly real. Instead of skulking in the shadows, he moves in plain sight, blending into the imaginary horror of the Halloween night. His kills are more brutal, his violence less clean and less precise. He is no longer the boogeyman or the shape, he is Michael Myers, and his brutality and cold-blooded violence makes him possibly more disturbing than he was in the original film. Halloween 2018 is by no means a perfect film, and it still does not quite live up to the original. The feeling of voyeurism and the constant sensation of being watched is gone. The effectively unsettling bloodless carnage is replaced with very extreme violence, some of which feels a little out of place, and there are issues in the middle of the film when it comes to pacing. While some attempt is made to make the victim sympathetic and subvert tropes present in the first film, apart from Laurie, her granddaughter, and her daughter, the characters can feel somewhat flat. There is also an out-of-nowhere twist in the latter half of the film which feels unearned and cheap, and the climax of the movie does tend to drag in places. However, where this film truly succeeds is in its characterization of Laurie Strode and its restoration of Michael Myers back to the menacing shape we came to fear from the first film. Holding the two characters up to one another as foils and showing how much they have affected one another's lives drives an unsettling but effective emotional impact through the film's center. This is the sequel which Halloween fans have been waiting for, but more than that, this is the characterization we deserve. Laurie Strode and Michael Myers became iconic characters for a reason, and this film allows them that status, giving us a sequel which can finally stand next to the original film.